A battle axe is an axe specifically designed for combat. Battle axes were specialized versions of utility axes. Many were suitable for use in one hand, while others were larger and were deployed two-handed. Axes designed for warfare ranged in weight from just over 0.5 kilograms to 3 kilograms, and in length from just over 30 centimeters to upwards of 1.5 meters, as in the case of the Danish axe or the sparth axe. Cleaving weapons longer than 1.5 meters would arguably fall into the category of polearms. Overview. Through the course of human history, commonplace objects have been pressed into service as weapons. Axes, by virtue of their ubiquity, are no exception. Besides axes designed for combat, there were many battle axes that doubled as tools. Axes could be modified into deadly projectiles as well. Axes were often cheaper than swords and considerably more available. Battle axes generally weigh far less than modern splitting axes, especially mauls, because they were designed to cut legs and arms rather than wood. Consequently, slightly narrow slicing blades are the norm. This facilitates deep, devastating wounds. Moreover, a lighter weapon is much quicker to bring to bear in combat and manipulate for repeated strikes against an adversary. The crescent-shaped heads of European battle axes of the Roman and post-Roman periods were usually made of wrought iron with a carbon steel edge, or, as time elapsed across the many centuries of the medieval era, steel. The hardwood handles of military axes came to be reinforced with metal bands called languettes, so that an enemy warrior could not cut the shaft. Some later specimens had all-metal handles. Battle axes are particularly associated in Western popular imagination with the Vikings. Certainly, Scandinavian foot soldiers and maritime marauders employed them as a stock weapon during the heyday, which extended from the beginning of the 8th century to the end of the 11th century. They produced several varieties, including specialized throwing axes and bearded axes or skegoks. Viking axes were wielded with one hand or two, depending on the length of the plain wooden haft. History. Europe prehistory and the ancient Mediterranean stone hand axes were in use in the Paleolithic period for hundreds of thousands of years. The first hafted stone axes appear to have been produced about 6000 BCE during the Mesolithic period. Technological development continued in the Neolithic period. Narrow axe heads made of cast metals were subsequently manufactured by artisans in the Middle East and then Europe during the Copper Age and the Bronze Age. The earliest specimens were socketless. More specifically, bronze battle axe heads are attested in the archaeological record from ancient China and the New Kingdom of ancient Egypt. Some of them were suited for practical use as infantry weapons, while others were clearly intended to be brandished as symbols of status and authority, judging by the quality of the decoration. In the eastern Mediterranean basin during the Iron Age, the double-bladed labrys axe was prevalent, and a hafted, single-bitted axe made of bronze or later iron was sometimes used as a weapon of war by the heavy infantry of ancient Greece, especially when confronted with thickly armored opponents. The sagaris, described as either single-bitted or double-bitted, became associated by the Greeks with the mythological Amazons, though these were generally ceremonial axes rather than practical implements. The Roman army equipped itself with axes. Legionaries used them as laboring tools rather than as weapons of war. However, the barbarian tribes that the Romans encountered north of the Alps did include iron war axes in their armories, alongside swords and spears. The Middle Ages battle axes were very common in Europe in the migration period and the subsequent Viking Age, and they famously figure on the 11th century century Bayeux tapestry, which depicts Norman mounted knights pitted against Anglo-Saxon infantrymen. They continued to be employed throughout the rest of the Middle Ages, with significant combatants being noted axe wielders in the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries. King Stephen of England famously used a Danish axe at the Battle of Lincoln 1141. One account says after his sword broke. Another says he used his sword only after his axe broke. Richard the Lionheart was often recorded in Victorian times wielding a large war axe, though references are sometimes wildly exaggerated as befitted a national hero. Long after he was quiet in his grave, his terrible battle axe, with 20 English pounds of English steel in its mighty head. A Child's History of England by Charles Dickens. Richard is, however, recorded as using a Danish axe at the relief of Jaffa. Geoffrey de Lusignan is another famous crusader associated with the axe. King Robert I of Scotland used an axe to defeat Henry de Bohun in single combat at the start of the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, and they enjoyed a sustained revival in use among heavily armoured equestrian combatants in the 15th century. Given that Bruce was wielding the axe on horseback, it is likely that the weapon in this case was a one-handed horseman's axe. In the 14th century, the use of axes is increasingly noted by Froissart in his Chronicle, which records the engagements between the kingdoms of France and England and the rise of professional armies in the 14th century. King John II is recorded as using one at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356 and Sir James Douglas at the Battle of Otterburn in 1388. Bretons were, apparently, noted axe users, with noted mercenaries Bertrand du Guesclin and Olivier de Clisson both wielding axes in battle. In these instances the type of battle axe, whether a Danish axe or the proto-poleaxe, is not recorded. Most medieval European battle axes had a socketed head, and some included languettes, long strips of metal affixed to the faces of the haft to prevent it from being damaged during combat. Occasionally the cheeks of the axe head bore engraved, etched, punched, or inlaid decorative patterns. Late-period battle axes tended to be of all-metal construction. Such medieval polearms as the halberd and the poleaxe were variants of the basic battle axe form. Steel plate armor covering almost all of a knight's body, and incorporating features specifically designed to defeat axe and sword blades become more common in the late 14th and early 15th century, leading to a generation of hafted weapons with points that concentrated impact, either to penetrate steel plate or to damage the joints of articulated plate. Increasingly daggers called misericords were carried, which enabled a sharp point to be thrust through gaps in armor if an opponent was disabled or being grappled with. Sword styles became more diverse, from the two-handed Zweihanders to more narrow thrusting instruments with sharply pointed tips, capable of penetrating any chinks in the armor of a fully encased opponent. For example, the estoc. The newly invented flanged mace, for example, was no crude bludgeon like its predecessors. The vertical flanges projecting at regular intervals from its head could fracture plate armor and smash into underlying body tissue, yet it was a much cheaper weapon to make than a sword, whose blade was inclined in any case to glance harmlessly off the smooth, curved plates of a well-designed suit of armor if used in a chopping manner. A sharp, sometimes curved pick was often fitted to the rear of the battle axe's blade to provide the user with a secondary weapon of penetration. A stabbing spike could be added, too, as a finial. Similarly, the war hammer evolved in late medieval times with the aim of punching its spiked head through helmets of breastplates. These armor penetrations were not always fatal. There are many accounts of plate-armored knights being struck struck with said weapons, and while the armor was damaged, the individual underneath survived and in some cases completely unharmed. It eventually became common for these various kinds of impact weapons to be made entirely from metal, thus doing away with reinforced wooden shafts. A useful visual guide to high medieval battle axes, contemporary with their employment, are the scenes of warfare depicted in the Maciejowski Bible of circa 1250. Battle axes also came to figure as heraldic devices on the coats of arms of several English and mainland European families. Post-medieval axes. Battle axes were eventually phased out at the end of the 16th century as military tactics began to revolve increasingly around the use of gunpowder. However, as late as the 1640s, Prince Rupert, a royalist general and cavalry commander during the English Civil War, is pictured carrying a battle axe. And this was not merely a decorative symbol of authority. The short pole axe was adopted by royalist cavalry officers to penetrate Roundhead troopers' helmets and cuirasses in close quarters fighting, and it was also used by their opponents. Sir Bevil Grenville was slain by a parliamentarian pole axe at the Battle of Lansdowne, and Sir Richard Bulstrode was wounded by one at the Battle of Edge Hill. In Scandinavia, however, the battle axe continued in use alongside the halberd, crossbow and pole axe until the start of the 18th century. The nature of Norwegian terrain in particular made pike and shot tactics impracticable in many cases. A law instituted in 1604 required all farmers to own weaponry to serve in the militia. The battle axe, much more wieldy than the pike or halberd and yet effective against mounted enemies, was a popular choice. Many such weapons were ornately decorated, and yet the functionality shows in the way that the axe head was mounted tilting upwards slightly, with a significant forward curve in the shaft, with the intent of making them more effective against armored opponents. During Napoleonic times, and later on in the 19th century, farriers in army service carried long and heavy axes as part of the kit. Although these could be used in an emergency for fighting, the primary use was logistical. The branded hooves of deceased military horses needed to be removed in order to prove that they had indeed died. Napoleon's pioneer corps also carried axes that were used for clearing vegetation, a practice employed by similar units in other armies. Middle East. The tabizon is the traditional battle axe of Persia. It bears one or two crescent-shaped blades. The long form of the tabor was about 7 feet long, while a shorter version was about 3 feet long. What made the Persian axe unique is the very thin handle, which is very light and always metallic. The tabor became one of the main weapons throughout the Middle East, and was always carried at a soldier's waist not only in Persia but Egypt, Afghanistan, and the Arab world from the time of the Crusades. Mamluk bodyguards were known as tabardier after the weapon. The tabizon is sometimes carried as a symbolic weapon by wandering dervishes. Asia, China. Different types of battle axes may be found in ancient China. In mythology, one of deity is Ingshan newer heavy axes. They were common in Zhou dynasty but lost the favor from user due to lack of mobility. Later, it only used in ceremony, and such battle axes made of bronze and jade have been found. The dagger axe is another form used in ancient times. India and Pakistan. The battle axe of ancient India was known as a parashu, made from iron, bamboo, wood, or wood steel. It usually measures between 3 to 5 feet, though some are as long as 7 feet. A typical parashu could have a single edge or double edge, with a hole for fixing a shaft. The haft is often tied with a leather sheet to provide a good grip. The cutting edges invariably broaden. The length of the haft could be about 3 to 4 feet. The parashute is often depicted in religious art as one of the weapons of Hindu deities such as Shiva and Durga. The sixth avatar of Lord Vishnu's Parashurama is named after the weapon. Parachutes are still used as domestic tools in Indian households, particularly in the villages, as well as being carried by certain sects of Eremitic Sadhu. As India fell to invaders from the Middle East during the 17th and 18th centuries, the Persian tabor became a standard in the Mughal armies of what is now India and Pakistan. Made entirely of metal or with a wood haft, it had a strongly curved blade and a hammer-headed pole and was often decorated with scroll work. Philippines. The panabas is the 19th century battle axe as well as the chopping tool favored by the Moro tribes of Mindanao. It ranges in size from 2 to 4 feet and usually 34 inches long and can be held with 1 or 2 hands. Hilts were often wrapped in rattan bindings or had metal collars. Due to its clean cutting capabilities, it was also sometimes used as an execution weapon. It is said that the Moro warriors wielding panabas would follow the main group of warriors up front and would immediately charge in on any American survivors of the first wave of attack during the Philippine-American War. Sri Lanka. The Kataria was a type of battle axe that was used in ancient Sri Lanka. A kataria consisted of a single edge and a short handle made of wood. This would allow the user to wield it with a single hand. Vietnam. The battle axe is one of the most common type of weapons found in Vietnamese ancient cultures, particularly Dong Son culture.